favourite ones, because we're going to ask you to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, and we'll have it on record, so when you see something really stupid, we can play it back in 10 years and we'll see what you said. So, of course we're giving no comment. So, what are the directions future research and practice will or should be taking, or possibly even could be taking? So, Seamus, do you want to lead on that one?
Yeah, sure. So, I think one thing that we need to become is much more experimental. In fact, very few projects should actually be done doing any more of these surveys, ringing up people and saying, well, what are you doing with digital preservation? How are you keeping those works of art, and how are you managing things? We need to do much more. Okay, let's look at a problem, let's do an experiment, let's see if we can push forward the process. And that's something that we pioneered here in Glasgow with the work that was done on plants with people like Brian Aitken in actually building experimental testbed, because reproducibility is a key aspect of science. And if we want to actually meet digital preservation, digital curation, to have any vestiges of science, then we have to actually create experimental models that allow us to reproduce our results. So I think that we're going to see much more recognition of that in a wider range of schools. So the work that Michael Nelson and Fox are doing in these places are going to become more commonly done elsewhere. Greater industrial engagement. I really do believe that 10 years from now, there will be more than 4 companies floating out there. I don't imagine that in 10 years that there'll be one as large as Google in the preservation arena, but I won't be surprised if there are certain kinds of companies that actually engage in it. And I don't know exactly how that'll work. There'll probably be some kind of distributed-based model. I don't know whether there'll be cloud-based models or what, but there will be something that may be socially based models as well. But there'll certainly be greater industrial engagement. But I think we need to go back and start asking whether or not we can put more intelligence into the digital objects themselves that we're creating, so that they are loss-proof. Something that I talked about a long time ago, safe harbor-seeking objects, that can actually know something about the context of the environment they're in and look for a place that's safer and more secure. So, simple thing, I never back up. No object's going to feel safe on my machine if it looks the log of how often the machine's backed up. So it's going to go, and it's going to go to Joy's machine, because Joy backs up all the time. Is that just a rumor, Joy? So the object will have the ability to find itself a safe home, but it will know it belonged to me, so it will keep in contact with me. It will have like almost ET capacity to phone home. Steal all this stuff from spyware, from viruses. You know, we don't need to invent anything new. So loss proofing and safe harbor seeking digital objects, I think, are going to be important. And I think we're going to need to have better ways of engaging organizations in sharing expertise and not in reducing duplication. And that's going to be important. And lastly, I don't know what audit certification is going to look like in the repository arena, but it has got to become much more important. I would like to know that even those cloud-based organizations like Amazon, Dropbox, that they have some kind of certification that allows me to know that when I leave my stuff there, that it is viable for long periods of time. And currently, if you took a checklist, such as the Delos checklist for digital libraries, and you considered your storage to be a digital library of some kind, and you try to apply that checklist to what you know about Dropbox or Amazon, you can just about do the user interface aspects of it, but you know nothing about the architecture behind it, or the management, or the mandate of the organization, or its policies and procedures. And we need a lot more regulation and transparency in that regard. So I suspect especially as public sector organizations use these cloud-based computing more, we're going to see increased amounts of legislation about how these organizations have to perform, in the same way we legislate pharmaceutical companies. And the last one is, the biggest thing, the biggest impact on digital preservation is going to be the increased use of the medical record. Medical records, there were, in I think it was 2010, some 4 billion DICOM X-rays. DICOM is a format for storing X-rays. So there were some 4 billion of them available. And that is a number that just keeps growing. And that's a fragment of a medical record. And increasingly, at an international scale, countries are trying to streamline get control of healthcare. And one of the important ways to do that is to develop better medical record systems. As they become more common, we're going to see many more preservation solutions, because those records, we need them over long periods of time.
Well, there's nothing I would disagree with there. I mean, I would maybe start from a slightly different place by, maybe I should start by sort of cryptic observation that I think in the past we've thought that the file is the kind of atomic unit of preservation, and if we can do things around files, everything will be fine. And I don't think that's ever really been true. And I think I want us to worry maybe slightly less about file formats. I don't mean not to worry about them, just let's not put that front and centre our concerns. Because the reality is that file formats have so many integrations with so many other things that it's difficult to separate them out. I'm speaking perhaps in riddles. Let me try and say this again. I don't know what data is. I don't know where data ends and software begins. I don't know where data exists in any kind of form or any kind of container that doesn't have some reliance on a library or an application or some sort of service. And as the Internet of Things takes off, every time you hear that, correct the person you're listening to and tell them that it's an Internet of interdependencies. And do we understand those interdependencies? I'm not sure that we do. But if everything is a service, the extent to which the file format is in any way sort of self-contained, the file is in any way self-contained, seems to me to be absurd. I think it always was. Some of you heard my story about the PDF containing the invitation to apply for a wonderfully high-powered job, which was done in a font which my PC couldn't render. And I got a document out that was windings. That's a PDF, for crying out loud. That could not be a simpler sort of format in some sense. Just wait until you look at databases. Just wait to look. And these are immediately with us already. The fact that we seem so incapable of preserving databases, I mean, it's probably the innovation of the century, or last century, the relational database. And why are we so poor at preserving it? Because we can't really separate out data from software, realistically. And I think, if I can push my luck a little bit, I think data is increasingly a discourse. We're told that data is valuable. And actually, I'm beginning to question the fundamentals here. I'm beginning to question whether we have somehow data standing alone separate from analysis. I think we're being told that that's the case. I don't think that is the case. I don't think there are fundamental philosophical issues there, but they're not really research directions for digital preservation. So let me come back. Let me express that then in a different sense. What are the interesting topics for the future? Well, if the file is no longer the object of preservation, or migration, might not be the solution for the future. And that means we have to be looking much more at emulation, and there's reason to be hopeful around emulation and virtualization as technology. The cloud, for all its failings, is a wonderful platform for distributing the sorts of solutions that we need. We always talk about the cloud for storage. The cloud is not for storage, the cloud is for compute. And if we can share the computing resources of the cloud, then we're going to be in a much better place than if we simply use the cloud for an additional backup to our hard disk. But this leads me on to a final kind of observation about research directions. I think, I'm absolutely certain, we're going to hear a great deal more about data protection, we're going to hear a great deal more about information security, we're going to hear a great deal more about cyber security. I'm absolutely certain of that. And the reason I know that is because when I try to lead conversations with politicians, with parliamentarians, with ministers, with senior civil servants, I start with digital preservation and I'm very quickly diverted into the right to be forgotten. That has a political edge or a political ear that we don't have. And to be honest, if we're not thinking about cyber security and we're not thinking about data protection and information governance, then we could potentially leave ourselves completely open to all sorts of problems in the future. We need to align digital preservation and curation with those concerns. We need to make it clear that retaining a small, important, select amount of information for future use is critical to organisations. Again, a slightly facetious case, Information and Records Management Society conference last year, I came across a phrase that was new to me. The phrase was a data diet. Recommendations to organisations go on data diets. Having data, it's bad for your organisation. Having too much data is bad for you. It's bad for you because it slows down retrieval. It's bad for you because it takes up space on your servers. It's bad for you because it contains possible risks. Lead that to the conclusion. The recommendation of the conference is size zero data diet. If you have no data, you have no liabilities. It's slightly absurd. You can see where I'm going with that, but fundamentally we need to be speaking to people and trying to make the case that this is not necessarily a future that we want.